All right, here is the flowchart for patch 14.19. You can always view the latest flowchart at tftflow.com. This was actually updated on day 1 of the patch, so like 4 or 5 days ago, and it's been updated a couple of times since. You can see those changes over here in the changelog. And the way the meta is set up right now is pretty straightforward. Over 80% of your games should be one of these default options. So you have 4 main carries that you can play around. You can play around Karma, you can play around Ryze, you can play around Varus, and you can play around Kalista. And depending on the items that you are given each game, most of the time that's going to determine which carry you play around. So if you have a Rage Blade, then you're going to play around Kalista. But if you have an Infinity Edge, you're going to play around Varus. If you have Blue Buff or Shojin, you might want to play around Karma. But if you have something like Archangel, Rabadon's Red Buff, you might want to play around Ryze. So your items are going to determine, in a lot of cases, as well as what other people are playing, which of these lines you play. But the overwhelming majority of your games should be one of these default options. Now, what we look at for everything else is all conditional, and in a lot of cases, even though it's conditional, it's still often not better than one of these 4-cost lines. So I wanted to start off with that. Now, when we move into hero augments here, one thing you're going to notice is that none of the hero augments that you can get offered on 2-1 are S tier. So the Ziggs Cassiopeia line, no longer S tier, when compared to some of the 4-cost lines that are available if you get Zap Attack. The same thing with Kog'Maw. Kog'Maw is definitely not going to compete with a lot of those 4-cost lines. And Molten Caramel is good, but the problem is so many people are playing Varus, you're not going to hit Rumble 3. And then when we look at Deja Vu, Galio has not been strong for a long time now. Then we move into the newest hero augment addition to the flowchart, and that's Spin to Win. But you'll notice you can't get Spin to Win on 2-1. So it doesn't give you direction. You're only playing Spin to Win if you're already angling Karma or if you're already angling Jinx. So this is not something that gives you direction at the beginning of the game. So you're still defaulting in the overwhelming majority of your games towards those 4-cost lines. Well, what about the Ornn artifacts? Are there a couple of lines that you can play around here? Well, there's still the Warwick line, which is doing even better in this patch. So if you get Vampiric Scepter, that's exceptionally great on Warwick. You can also go with Rapid Fire on Warwick as well. But if you look at a lot of these other lines, like Gold Collector into Jinx Wukong or Blaster Reroll, or any of these items that are good on Wukong in general, most of the time, these are not scratching the surface into S tier because it's better to just play around 4-cost when everybody else is playing around 4-cost. Now, you still have Manazane Ziggs doing quite well. There's also the addition of this Fiora line, which again is a nod to the fact that 4-cost are doing so well. And the rest of these are all in A tier. So you're still defaulting towards the 4-cost. Then we move down and we go into your +1 emblems. So Vertical Portal, still doing well, but you're playing around Ryze. So is that really any different from what other people are doing? When it comes to Frost Emblem, it's doing relatively well. But most of these lines that you're looking at here, these verticals, are pretty much playing around the same 4-cost. Like this is playing around Varus, this is playing around Ryze, this is playing around Karma, this is playing around Ryze, this is playing around Varus, although you can play, in this case, you're playing Reroll, so you're really playing around Ezreal more. So that's a little bit different. This is playing around Varus. This is still playing around Kalista. So most of these lines, the only one that's like really different here is Vertical Eldritch. Most of the time, you're still playing around the exact same copies or the exact same carries in the backline. Same thing here with Warriors. This has moved up where you're now playing around Fiora Gwen because Fiora Gwen are so good. They're a lot stronger than they were before. And then now Sugarcraft is doing relatively well. So you can play around this. This is a slightly different line. So there are some different variations here, but you'll notice that most of them that get away from the 4 main carries are not S tier. So you're still looking to play around the same 4-cost carries most of the time. Then we go into resource conditions. None of these things are S tier in most cases. Now, sometimes you have a better start for these things than others, so that's why they're here. It's better to play something you have a better start for than something you don't have a good start for. But even if you have perfect items like Jinx Wukong, Cassiopeia Shapeshifter Reroll, and Ziggs Cassiopeia, these things typically are not going to cap out higher than a lot of the 4-cost lines that you see people defaulting to. And then lastly, we have our directional augments here. So if you get one of these augments, a lot of times it's going to tell you pretty much exactly what composition you want to play based on what you have the best spot for. And there are a couple of things here that enable you to play things that are a little bit different, like learning to spell being S tier with Veigar Vex or with Ziggs Cassiopeia. That's escaping a little bit from the 4-cost. There's a couple of other conditions here that are quite good, but most of those conditions are powering up your 4-cost. So when it comes to how to play this patch, the big thing to keep in mind is that you want to play around these default options and you want to study how to make these 4-cost options as powerful as possible. All right, let's start talking about some of these default options, starting off with Karma. So Karma Preservers has been the same for a long time now, where you play around Preservers and then add in the Warrior package with Fiora plus Gwen. The main change for this patch is that Gwen is actually a unit. She's very strong now, so much so that I've actually seen a lot of high-level players prioritize the blue buff on Gwen over Karma. So what that would look like is you'd actually drop out of this Ionic Spark utility, you'd move the blue buff onto Gwen, and then you'd build Shiv onto Karma. And you basically play Karma like a utility bot where she applies anti-heal as well as shred, and then Gwen and Fiora are your triple carries ideally that do a ton of damage to the entire board, and they're kind of doing the majority of the damage, especially Gwen here. I would argue that Gwen is better to itemize than Fiora on this patch. Both are very good with Trenchcoat. I think Fiora is slightly better, and if you're able to get Trenchcoat plus Zanya's from something like What the Forge, that is completely broken on Gwen. Now, as usual, if you're not able to find the 5 costs with Morgana and Milio on level 8, you can play around the Shapeshifters with Nico plus Nasus, and you can also play around Briar. Now, one thing of note with Briar is that this actually enables an entirely different variation of Karma, where you drop out of the Warriors and you put the items onto Briar here. So let's go ahead and show that real quickly. And then you just fill out with the 5 costs, so that would be your Morgana and your Milio. And then on level 9, you're going to add either an Incanter or a Camille. And the main idea when it comes to playing around Karma is you're really just trying to find upgrades. That's really the most important part. You really don't care exactly what that upgrade is. It's just important that you're able to find your upgraded units and push to level 9. So you can play around Fiora Gwen, you can play around Briar, and yet there's even another option where you play around Olaf. So this is the max cap version of playing around Olaf here. The main idea with playing Olaf is not that it's stronger than the other options, but sometimes you're just contested on Fiora and Gwen. You can't find those units, and it's also hard to find Briar. So you end up finding some Olafs. This is what you play around. Now, there's sort of a default line that you would go for on level 8. So this has a lot of 5 cost here. The default option on level 8 is you drop out of all of these things, you add Twitch in for 3 Frost, 2 Hunter, and this is like your shell. These are the 5 units you're pretty much always going to be playing on level 8. And then usually you're going to add 2 more Chrono to your board. So that would be Vex plus Jax here. And the reason you're adding these 2 units is because there's actually good synergy between Chrono and Olaf, where he provides himself CC immunity during his ability. And that actually ignores Chrono if he's in the middle of his ability. So he'll continue to attack when the entire board gets stunned by Chrono. That's a pretty big deal. And it actually makes him effectively a Chrono unit in some ways. So very good synergy there. And then the last unit can either be an Incanter or another Preserver. So you could add in Bard here, you could add in Morgana here, or you could go ahead and add in something like Cassiopeia for Incanter. But the main idea here is that you have the shell of 3 Frost, 2 Hunter, 4 Chrono, and your Olaf kind of synergizes well with that. Very cheap board that should hopefully help you be able to push to level 9. And then you start looking to try to max cap around your Diana, your Tarek, your Milio, and your 4 Preserver. So just something to keep in mind. Eventually, you do want to get out of this 4 Chrono. I do not think it's how you want to end the game. In some circumstances, you're not going to have any choice, but worth keeping in mind. All right, next up, let's talk about Ryze. So Ryze Preservers is been the same since last patch. And the big thing here that I want to talk about is the shell that you should use for building out your composition on level 8. So let's go ahead and remove the non-core units here and kind of start off here with what I would call the core composition, which is 4 Scholars in the backline, and this can be an Ahri instead of a Milio if you don't have Milio yet, and then Tarek for 3 Portal. This is pretty much always going to get played. And now you have to figure out, how do I fill out the rest of this board? Well, the straightforward thing to do is to go ahead and just add a Bastion to pair with your Tarek. So let's go ahead and throw in a Hecarim. And now your remaining 2 slots can be any 2 frontline units that share a frontline trait. So that would be something like, you could just add more Bastions if you wanted to. So that would be Diana plus Shen. 4 Bastion, 4 Scholar. You could go ahead and add 2 Vanguards, where you have Mordekaiser plus Tahm Kench. So let's find Tahm Kench here. And then in this case, you might actually want to drop out of the Bard and play Ahri instead. And then you get 3 Arcana. This could be Shapeshifters. So you can drop out of these 2 and play around something like Nico plus Nasus, or maybe play around Briar if you're able to hit that. You can also play around the best option, which is what the comp is named after, which is Preservers. So this would be your Rakan plus Morgana. And then in this case, of course, you would want to make sure that you're playing Bard in the backline here to get even more Preservers. And then eventually you want to replace this Hecarim with Diana. And then lastly, you add in your Zillion. But the main idea here to understand is that you're pretty much always playing the 4 Scholars plus Tarek, and then you're looking to figure out how to fill out the rest of your front line on level 8. The last option that's available is you can actually play around Portal here and go vertical into the trait. Now, this is pretty much only good if you get little buddies. So you can go ahead and add in Kassadin, Galio, and something like Jace. And now you have 5 little buddies on your board if you drop this for Ahri for your Milio, your Taric, and your Ryze, which is quite strong. It can actually get you to level 9. Now, of course, in the late game, this is going to fall off really hard because you don't have a real front line here, because you have a bunch of 2 cost and 1 cost that are in your front line, and you're not even giving a trait to your primary tank. So this is not something that will work in the long term, but if you have something like Little Buddies, this can be quite good. Just remember that the main idea here is that you're always trying to play around 4 Scholar plus Taric, and then fill out the rest of the board with frontline units, and those frontline units are pretty flexible. It's just that Preservers happen to be the best option. So make sure you're keeping that in mind when doing your 4-2 roll down. All right, next up, I want to talk about Arcana Varus. So this is one of the most popular comps in the meta right now. I would argue it is the most popular. And the big thing about this is that you're looking to build red buff plus IE onto Varus. This is pretty much like core 2 items that you pretty much always want to have. And then the third item is a lot more flexible here. Second IE is doing relatively well right now. Could be Deathblade like I showed originally, can be Shojin, could be GS, could be Runons, but the big thing is you really want to get this red buff plus IE in most cases, and then that third item could be any sword item, could be any bow item, and you'll do relatively well. The main idea behind this comp is you're trying to activate as many traits as possible so that when you Arcana onto Tahm Kench, his Arcana bonus gives you more HP for each trait that you have active. Ends up being around 600 HP, I believe, with this exact board. If you do the Arcana bonus onto him, very good. If you fight against Kalista, if you fight against 5 Faerie Recon Kalista, you're going to want to switch this Arcana bonus over to Hecarim so that ideally you have enough damage to kill the Recon. If you don't do this, unfortunately, Varus is not going to kill the Recon with the first cast, and by the time he gets to his second cast, usually the Recon heals up enough that the Varus will not execute on the second cast either, and you end up just not killing hardly any units at all. It's a pretty bad matchup for this comp, and one of the things that I've seen kind of adjust over time is sometimes you actually drop out of these 2 preservers here and you end up playing around 4 blaster instead. So that would be your Smolder plus Ezreal. And now you'll have enough damage to kill through these Recons that are immortal otherwise, because your Varus actually does enough damage to just straight up kill them. Another thing of note here is that in some cases you're actually going to want to play around other units that you might hit. Like for example, if you hit Nasus, you might want to drop out of this Ahri. You're losing a little bit of Arcana value, but if you hit a Nasus too, that can be quite good. Same thing with Smolder. If you have a spot for Smolder, maybe you're going to end up not playing 4 Blaster, but you end up playing something like Ahri here, so you still have your 4 Arcana, and then you have Nasus plus Briar on your board. The big thing here to understand is that, again, it's about upgrades, and the problem with less than 4 Blaster is sometimes you're going to have a tough time killing Recons if there are any Faerie players in your lobby. Outside of that, this line is pretty good. One last thing of note here is that the solo frontline tech works relatively well for like getting everything clumped around your Tahm Kench and Varus kills everything. That can work relatively well if you're not fighting against any other Varus players. If you are playing against other Varus players, generally speaking, I don't recommend this. So you would want to move up your units to the front line. And the big thing of note here is that you want your Tahm Kench to always be 3 units in from either the left or the right so that he will ult towards the enemy's corner carry. So for example, if there is a Varus in this corner here, this Tahm Kench, a high percentage of the time, is going to ult towards him because the way Tahm Kench's ability works is he ults towards the furthest unit within 4 hexes. So you can see this is exactly 4 hexes away. Same thing with this corner. So generally speaking, position your Tahm Kench 3rd row in or 3rd hex in from the left or right, and you'll be able to get their enemy corner carry. And that's it for Arcana Varus. The last default option I want to talk about here is 5 Faerie Kalista. This is the menace from last patch. So they did nerf it. They nerfed this Queen Guard's armor to have less increased healing and shielding, as well as less healing from the Queen damage dealt. It is still completely broken. The big thing about this comp is that it is an upgrade check. If you're able to hit Recon 2 plus Kalista 2, you're pretty much guaranteed top 4. If you're able to go level 9 and upgrade your Camille and Morgana, you're probably going to go first place. Now, the other thing with this comp is you need to have really good items. Now, on Recon, Warmogs is pretty much always going to be best in slot because his shielding scales with HP, so he gets a bigger shield the more HP he has. So Warmogs is completely broken, and then Gargoyle is very good because it increases the effective HP that he has by adding resistances to that HP and those shields that he produces, as well as the healing from Kalista. So it is his most popular build, and I actually think it's his best build. Warmogs plus Gargoyle. You can build him other ways. I think pretty much all of them are worse than this particular build. So you can replace this Gargoyle with something like Protector's Vow. You can replace it with Steadfast. You can replace it with Redemption. But the big thing here that I generally would go for is this best in slot standard build that you usually see. And then on Kalista, you pretty much always need to have one Rage Blade. And then the second item is ideally another Rage Blade. It can also be Gunblade. It can also be Last Whisper. Now, the thing about Last Whisper is you really, in this particular composition, do not want your utility on either Rakan or Kalista. Okay, like your entire composition revolves around these two units. So you want these units to do, in the case of Rakan, as much tanking as possible. And in the case of Kalista, as much damage as possible. You don't want to put utility items onto these units because a lot of the power budget in utility goes into the utility that it provides and not the stats that it provides. So you would much rather have your anti-heal, your Sunder, your Shred, all on other units. So something to keep in mind here is like your red buff, your Morello ideally is going on to Melio or anything else. You want to leave your Kalista and Rakan with the perfect damage dealer and tank items. Get your utility elsewhere in the ideal world. All right, next up we have our hero augments here, and I want to move through this a lot quicker than I have in the past because a lot of this hasn't changed that much, and also I really want to emphasize that 80% of this patch really is those default options I already talked about. So starting off with Ziggs Cassiopeia, it's the same as last patch. If you get the Blitzcrank hero augment, you're looking to build Crown Guard, Warmogs, Gargoyle, and Ionic Spark onto the Blitz. Those 4 items are pretty good. You build Ziggs the same way you always build him with blue buff, anti-heal, Rabadons, Mana Zane. These are all really good items. And then on Cassiopeia, you're looking for attack speed and Shiv. And that's it for this line. For your Arcana bonus, usually it's going to go onto Ari because you have a bunch of 3 stars. So you're going to get a bunch of AP from that. And all of your units scale with AP relatively well, including your frontline, can be very strong. Next up, we have Arcana Kog'Maw. So this is different from Hunter Kog'Maw. In the past, you would see us play around 4 Hunter here. And instead, I looked at the stats and I found that playing around Arcana is infinitely better. So instead of, let's just go ahead and drop out of the Seraph here. In the past, what you were doing is you'd actually not play the Tahm Kench or the Hecarim, and you would actually play around Olaf plus Twitch. And then on level 8, you would add in Diana. But most of the time that was pretty weak. You were not getting to level 8 for Diana, and it just didn't feel that strong. If you go in the stats and you look at this particular board here, where you play around 2 Arcana, it's very strong. If you're able to get Vanguard plus 1, it's even stronger. So something to keep in mind here is you don't go for 4 Hunter if you're rerolling Kog'Maw. Just go ahead and add more Arcana onto your board. Make sure that your Arcana is on Hecarim here. That is the strongest option that you have. Now we have Molten Caramel. So the big thing about Molten Caramel is that it hasn't changed at all. They didn't nerf it as far as I know. But the problem here is that because so many people are playing Varus and so many people are contesting Tahm Kench and Rumble on their boards, it's really hard for you to hit Rumble 3, first of all. And second of all, you're going to have a really tough time being able to even find Tahm Kench 2, and forget it when it comes to Rakan. You're not going to find Rakan either. So the biggest issue with this line is that you're just not able to hit the units because they're too contested by the level 8 boards. The same thing is true here with Blaster Caramel. This is a little bit better because at the very least, you're trying to play around some pretty strong backline units here with Ezreal, but Ezreal got nerfed and it's noticeable. He's definitely a lot weaker than he was last patch. So even if you have your Blaster plus 1, still not as strong as it was last patch. Deja Vu, same thing it's always been. Deja Vu's always struggled in the meta. It's not ever been strong. It's also never been completely unplayable. It's still in that spot now. If you have a Rage Blade on 2-1, you take Deja Vu. It's fun. It's still a B tier comp. Not very good, but it's something that you can play if you want some variety in your life. Same issue here, by the way, that Tahm Kench is very contested. Same thing with Rumble. So finding these units can actually be quite hard. You're probably not going to be able to 3-star your Rumble. So yeah, you're in a pretty rough spot here just due to the nature of the units that the Arcana Varus board plays. Now we move into Spin to Win. So this is new, but this doesn't give direction. So this is not a 3-1 augment. There's 2 main different ways that you can play into this. The first way is you can play into Karma Wukong. This has been around since the start of the set, before the set even went live. This was something that was discovered on PBE. And the main idea behind this is you're looking to just play a bunch of preservers. You have your frontline Wukong with Gargoyle, BT, and Sterix, as I believe is best in slot. Titans is pretty good as well. You can also go double Gargoyle if you have to, but you really want to get that BT onto him. And then you're looking to itemize Karma in the backline here. Add as many preservers as possible. Keep that Wukong alive as long as possible. It can be pretty hard to get to this board, of course, because you're going to be rolling on level 7. So this is something you really should only do if you're already angling Karma at the time that you get offered Spin to Win. The next option here is if you have perfect items and you're already kind of going for that Jinx Wukong thing, then being able to get the spin to win augment with Jinx Wukong is very strong. And again, you would switch over to the BT plus Sterix over this Gargoyle plus Warmogs that you typically see with the standard build of Wukong. But the main thing of note here is that these things don't give direction. You already have to be kind of going in this direction for this augment to be good. Otherwise, you might end up trapping yourself into a 3-cost reroll that is pretty hard to play in the current meta unless you're super healthy when you take the augment. Next up, we have the artifact lines, starting off with by far the most broken one, Corrupt Vampiric Scepter into Warwick, as well as Rapid Fire Cannon into Warwick. I want to note, Rapid Fire Cannon into Warwick is a lot weaker than Corrupt Vampiric Scepter. This is S+ tier. Like, there isn't a tier that's high enough to describe how good Corrupt Vampiric Scepter into Warwick reroll is. It's pretty much guaranteed top 3, whereas this one, you're actually going to kind of have to fight for it. Now, the big thing that people mess up with this is they usually don't know how to build out the Warwick after they get their artifact for him. So the first thing of note is that Titans is by far his best craftable item that people are undervaluing. You do not want Bloodthirster on Warwick. People mess this up all the time. You do not need any Omnivamp on Warwick. He already gets enough Omnivamp from his auto attacks as well as Corrupt Vampiric Scepter if you have that item. Or if you have RFC, he's not taking enough damage because he's in the 2nd row or the 3rd row. So you don't have to worry about him having as much Omnivamp. His auto attacks will do more than enough. Also, Titan scales up the healing from his auto attacks. So make sure that when you build Warwick, you don't put Omnivamp onto him. Make sure that you're building this Titans, and then the next best item is Rageblade. In the case of Corrupt Vampiric Scepter, you can actually replace the Rageblade with QSS if you have to, if you don't have enough bows, which will happen a decent percentage of the time, because you also want red buff on Twitch for anti-heal. So the best in slot on Twitch is blue buff, red buff, plus IE. Of course, you can also go GS, Deathblade, Shojin in some cases is like kind of okay. Blue buff is obviously better. But the big thing with here, or with Twitch, is you want to make sure that you get a full build onto him. And then lastly, you'll build out some sort of tank or Olaf. It doesn't really matter who that 3rd or 4th unit is. Eventually, you want to have a full build on Olaf if you really want to win the game. But that's mainly it for Warwick reroll. Very, 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 very strong if you have Corrupt Vampiric Scepter. Now, Gold Collector here, we've already talked about Jinx Wukong. We already talked about Blaster reroll. These artifacts are good for these comps. Okay, Gold Collector on Jinx is good. Gold Collector on Ezreal is good. Eternal Winter and Innervating Locket, both very good on Wukong. But here's the thing. In most cases, it's better to just play these artifacts in the 4-cost line. So Gold Collector on Varus, Eternal Winter, and Innervating Locket on Rakan, for example. So the reason these are in A tier is to denote that those default options are typically still better, even though these are enablers for some of these reroll comps. Now, Mana Zane Ziggs, still very strong. Silvermere Dawn on Hecarim, it's okay. It's still pretty decent. It's still something you can consider angling into. And for sure, Hecarim is a good item holder for Silvermere Dawn, even if you don't want to play around specifically multi-strikers. Now, of course, if you're able to hit Hecarim 3 with Silvermere Dawn 7 multi-striker, you have a very good chance of winning the game. The problem is that Hecarim is contested by the Arcana Varus players as well as the Kalista players. It's very unlikely you're going to be able to hit Hecarim 3 before people start dying in the lobby. And the thing that's different about this patch is because they nerfed Hecarim, it's a little bit less likely that you're going to be stable enough to wait until other people die to roll for Hecarim 3. So it's been moved down to A tier from S tier, still good, but now you're probably better off playing around the 4-cost line with Silvermere Dawn with Fiora. Also, Suspicious Trenchcoat is very good on Fiora, so you can either play this in Warriors if you have a Warrior +1, but most of the time you're going to end up playing this with Karma. We also have Unending Despair into Ziggs Cassiopeia on Blitzcrank. We have Unending Despair into Blaster reroll on Mordekaiser, and then lastly we have Unending Despair on Vex in Vex Veigar. So in this comp in particular, the big thing with this is that you can't really play 7 Mage if you don't have a Mage +1. You should play 7 Mage if you do have the Mage +1, but if you don't have it, I would not play Soraka plus Seraphine on your board. Instead, you're going to play something like this. The Arcana cap is a lot lower now after the changes that they've made to Xerath like 2 or 3 patches ago, where they reduced the amount of true damage that you got per 3 charms. So keep that in mind. Generally, you're going to finish the game on this board when you're playing Vex Veigar. And then the last option here is Wit's End End into Ziggs Cassiopeia. We've talked about that already. The other line here is Cassiopeia Shapeshifter Reroll. With this in particular, you really want to get that Wit's End ideally from like a portal, for example, so that you can click one of these broken augments on 2-1. This is one of those comps that is very augment dependent. So if you don't have one of those good augments on 2-1 and you just have a Wit's End, if you're not able to get best in slot onto Cassiopeia, you're going to have a rough time. So something to keep in mind here is that this needs to have Nico 3, it needs to have your Cassiopeia 3, kind of wants the Syndra 3, or at the very least Karma 2. It's pretty difficult to get into a right spot for this comp. That's why the augments are so important here. So just having Wit's End is not necessarily enough to guarantee that you're going to top 4 with this line. All right, now we move into the next section, which is the +1 emblems. Again, I'm going to move through this relatively quickly because a lot of this stuff has been the same for a long time. For example, Vertical Portal, still in S tier, still very good, still played the exact same way where you have 8 Portal, 3 Mage, Diana with your Portal Spat in the ideal world. You also have Nico as a really good unit that you can play to pair with Jace and Zoe in the early game and the mid game. You also have Rumble that can be good to pair with your Galio plus your Ezreal. You can also play Tom Kench to pair with your Galio. So before you find this Diana, there's a lot of options. In some cases, you're looking to play around Vex here if you don't have the Nami. So this is the same as it's been for a very long time. Little Buddy's broken. Hopefully this is something at this point you're familiar with if you've been playing for the last couple of patches, because Portal's been popular for a long time. Still S tier if you're able to get it. Pretty much the only vertical that's kind of still really holding the line over the last couple of patches. Vertical Frost, still good. I've lowered it down to A tier because the cap feels like it's a little bit lower than it has been in the past, but this might still belong in S tier. It's really kind of on that line. If you're able to hit this board on tempo and get up to level 9 and actually like really have the entire thing online, especially with Diana 2, this is very, very, very strong. The problem is that sometimes getting there can be a little bit difficult, but it is still good. The big thing here is that you're contesting Varus with the Varus players, so it can actually be very difficult to hit Varus 2, whereas in the past when you played Frost, it was a lot easier to hit Varus 2 because not that many people were playing Varus. Now we still have the Witchcraft options. I've put them in A tier because 6 Witchcraft itself is actually not that strong. However, 8 Witchcraft is obviously broken, so if you look at the stats on Witchcraft, it still looks like it's S tier. It's still very strong, but if you're stuck with 6 Witchcraft, it's definitely going to be noticeably kind of like on par with a lot of other A tier comps. So you have 2 main options with this, with Ryze and Karma. The only difference between the 2 of these is that Ryze gets played with Taric and some Scholars, and Karma gets played with a slightly different frontline here. It's really otherwise the exact same line. Okay, so the only difference is the carry that you play. You're dropping out of the Taric. Otherwise, it's the exact same thing. We have Blasters. So Blasters here, there's 2 main ways to play it. You can either play 6 Blaster Reroll, which is basically the same thing as the standard Blaster Reroll. You just drop out of this Taric here, and you add in your Smolder ideally, and then you get your Blaster +1 on anybody. It doesn't really matter who it is. And now you have your 6 Blaster. The big thing with this is that Ezreal and Varus just completely wipe the board within seconds. The problem is it's really, really hard to get to this board after the nerf that they made to Ezreal. So this actually should probably be like closer to A tier than S tier, whereas 6 Blaster Arcana is completely broken. Okay, if you're able to get to this board where you have your Varus just doing infinite damage on his first cast, he just wipes the entire board in seconds, you will literally see fights that finish within like 8 to 10 seconds. It's that fast. So 6 Blaster Arcana, very, very, very strong. You do your Arcana bonus onto Hecarim to get even more AD so that that first Varus cast is even scarier. And in a lot of cases, the entire fight gets ended within the first few seconds when Varus cast. You can go ahead and replace this Deathblade here with something like Red Buff. And I think Shojin's actually pretty good when you're playing 6 Blaster, just because those casts do so much damage that just getting to that first cast is highly impactful. Faerie +1. The reason it's not in S tier is that I don't think it's usually worth using the augment slot on this, because all it really allows you to do is play a slightly higher quality 5 Faerie board where you're able to add Arcana to the board. It's okay. It's definitely better than playing a Katarina on your board, but the big thing with Faerie +1 is trying to get to 9 Faerie. If you're not able to get to 9 Faerie with +2, it's not really that big of a deal. So that's why I have it in A tier here. You're usually better off just getting some sort of combat augment or some sort of econ augment that guarantees that you can hit your Rakan 2 plus Kalista 2, as that's that's more impactful. Another option here that's new for this patch is the +1 Hunter emblem, enabling you to play 6 Hunter Jinx Wukong. So it's the exact same as the standard Jinx Wukong, except now you're just going to play 1 less Preserver, and you're going to end up with the 6 Hunter activated here. Gives a lot of AD to Jinx. Basically, this is a blitzkrieg strategy where you're trying to kill their board before they kill yours. Very, very fast. Sort of like Blasters, but I think it's worse than Blasters. So that's why it's an A tier here. Next up, we have Arcana Kog'Maw. We talked about this before. The big thing with this is just getting that Vanguard +1 is very good because this is the board you want to play anyway. You're actually just going to play this even if you don't have the Vanguard +1. So if you do have the Vanguard +1, that just enables you to be able to play 4 Vanguard for free. It's very strong. In fact, it's actually one of the best augments you can get for the comp. One of the few times that Vanguard emblem is actually good. Then we have Eldritch +1. So this can be very, very strong if you're able to hit the Briar 2. If you're not able to hit Briar 2, most of the time this is going to fall off, unless you're also able to hit School Mascot, in which case it's quite good. Most of the time, you're not going to actually get to play around Syndra 3. It is what it is, because unless you have Caretaker's Ally, which is another whole bag of worms, usually you're not going to be able to just sit on level 6 and roll. You're actually going to have to just push levels so that you're able to find the Briar, because Briar is often what's going to stabilize your entire board. The big issue with this comp in general is that you're so reliant on Volibear, because Nami and Syndra don't do a lot of single target damage, unfortunately. So this comp has some issues, but it is performing a lot better in the stats, especially if you're able to hit School Mascot. 6 Chrono Preservers, still broken. Same idea as it's been in the past, where you're just looking to play 6 Chrono with a bunch of Preservers. That's literally it. That's your entire board, and it is incredibly broken. Still very, very good. Still S tier if you're able to hit it. 6 Warriors. So this got a massive buff, where the 6 Warriors, first of all, Gwen got buffed, right, with the AI change. But the other thing is that 6 Warrior has damage reduction, and that damage reduction makes a huge difference. So between the Gwen buff and the damage reduction, and there was a couple of other changes where they buffed 4 Warriors, so the transition is a little bit easier. If you have a Warrior +1, playing around vertical Warriors is very strong. I think in most cases it's better to just push levels, but if you have a lot of Nyla, I have seen 6 Warrior Nyla be incredibly strong. The big issue with this is that if you spend all of your gold rolling on level 6, it's going to be incredibly difficult to find Gwen 2 and Fiora 2, and these 2 units are absolute beast, especially Gwen. So giving up on the ability to find Gwen 2 easily by playing Reroll, in general, I don't think it's worth it, but Warriors are very strong right now. The other thing that's kind of come back here is 6 Sugarcraft. We've already talked about Arcana Varus a bunch of times. You're just now adding Arcana +1 to make the bonus even stronger. So Sugarcraft is back now, and the big thing with Sugarcraft is that because Gwen is an actual unit, they not only buff 6 Sugarcraft, but now Gwen does so much damage. I would actually go as far as to say that you really just want to have full carry items on the Gwen, so forget the Ionic Spark. Just go for something like blue buff on this Gwen, and then try to build shivs somewhere else in the comp, because you really want your Gwen to 1v9. And it will 1v9 if you give it the best possible items. One thing I want to note here, Mana Zane Gwen, incredibly strong right now. So there are a bunch of things that can make this Gwen really powerful. It's still an A tier in my opinion, but I might creep this up to S tier just because I've seen it do really well in a couple of lobbies. And then the last option here is Pyro Emblem Varus. This is just another variation to your Arcana Varus type boards, except now instead of going into a bunch of traits, you're now trying to push into more Pyro, and 4 Blaster can be pretty good. But again, this is just another variation of playing around Blasters plus Arcana plus Pyro. Pretty good, but just another extension to a lot of the different Varus options that you've seen already. And that's kind of the story of most +1 emblems, where you're still kind of just playing around the same 4 costs that you play around in the default options, but now you have some different lines that are unlocked with those exact same carries. Just sort of how this patch is. All right, next up we have resource conditions. This is a new section on the website that's focused on resources that you have, such as items or gold or HP or whatever else. And based on those resources, what comps can you play, or what comps are enabled by having those resources. So for example, having perfect items makes it possible for you to play Jinx, makes it possible for you to play either Cassiopeia or line. If you have a lot of items, then it's a lot easier to play Blaster Reroll or Ziggs Cassiopeia. But here's the thing about this is that having a lot of items is actually in general general very good on this patch because 4-cost and 5-cost comps can actually use a lot of items. So the big thing about this is not to say that if you have a high number of items, you can't play other comps. It's to say that these particular comps are enabled by having these conditions met. Whereas you can still play Karma without a lot of items, it's just very helpful if you have a lot of items. Whereas with Blaster Reroll, you really can't play it unless you do have a lot of items because you want to itemize so many different units. And the same thing is true here in the Ziggs Cassiopeia comp. And again, the same thing is true for these Jinx Wukong, Cassiopeia Reroll. Like, you need to have really good items in these comps to make them work. All right, we are in the final section of the flowchart. This is your directional augments. When you click one of these augments, you have a pretty good idea on what you're looking to play. Starting off with economy augments, these are the best types of augments that you can get on 2-1. These are augments that give you gold. These are augments that give you XP. These are augments that make it easier for you to reach your desired board on 4-1 or 4-2 when you do your level 8 roll down. You find your desired 4-cost, and then you get to push to level 9 and play around 5-cost. That's why econ augments are so good right now, because it enables you to hit your desired board in a meta that revolves around 4-cost and 5-cost. If you're not able to find an econ augment, there's a lot of other options here that I have listed, but in general, if an econ augment gets offered to you, you should probably click on it. Now let's talk about some other augments here, starting off with Learning to Spell. So any of the Cassiopeia lines are good with Learning to Spell. Ryze Preservers is also good with Learning to Spell. The big thing with this one is that Karma Preservers is not as good with Learning to Spell because you're usually playing some sort of AD carry, whether it be Fiora or Briar or Olaf. With Ryze Preservers, on the other hand, your entire board is just AP. And also your tank scales with AP when it comes to Ryze Preservers. So AP is a lot more valuable for Ryze Preservers than it is for Karma Preservers. That's why it's good with this comp and not with Karma Preservers. It's also very good with Veigar Vex, makes the shields on Vex incredibly huge, makes her a lot tankier, gives you infinite scaling. If you're able to hit Vex 3 and Veigar 3 with Learning to Spell, there's a very high chance that you're able to go first place. A higher education into Ryze Preservers, also pretty good, gives attack speed to all of your scholars. Now we have some other options here, and all of them you'll notice are A tier. So none of these are better than just getting an econ augment and playing into one of the default lines, but these are other options that are available. So March of Progress into 3-cost reroll, whether that be Blasters, whether that be Nico plus Swain, and then Cassiopeia Syndra in the backline, or Vex Veigar. They're all viable, but they're not as good as just playing around 4-cost. Too tanky, you can play this into Honeymancy Ziggs. This is different from the Ziggs Cassiopeia line because you actually drop Cassiopeia and Poppy, and you just play 5 Honeymancy. 5 Honeymancy is actually worth playing if you have too tanky, because you just play double Blitzcrank and double Nunu, and they do a ton of damage. But in general, this line is not very strong. At least it's an A tier line. Again, not as good as your default options. And that's true for all of these different things, okay? So you're looking to double up your tanks with these options, but again, none of them are going to be better than playing around a 4-cost line. With all that shimmers, you have 2 main options here. You have Gold Collector and Gambler's Blade. Gold Collector is very good on Jinx. If you have a good spot for Jinx, this can actually be S tier. Otherwise, it's usually going to be A tier. Blaster Reroll, in general, probably going to be A tier or B tier. And then 6 Shapeshifter Dragon, I would generally only play this in Champion Conference, where you can guarantee that you get that Smolder or Briar. Very valuable in that particular setup. Otherwise, most of the time, this Gold Collector is actually going to get played into, you guessed it, Arcana Varus. Gambler's Blade into Ziggs Cassiopeia on the Cassiopeia is pretty good as well. School Mascot into Vertical Eldritch is good, but only if you're able to get Eldritch +1, so it has to be an A tier because there's a chance you don't get that Eldritch +1. If you do get Eldritch +1, it can actually win the lobby. So this has the capability of being S tier, but without Eldritch +1, it can be very difficult to hit 7 Eldritch because it's dependent on finding a Briar, and if you don't find that Briar on level 8, you're going to have a rough time. Unleash the Beast, we already talked about this with Silvermere Dawn Hecarim. The main issue here is Hecarim gets played with Arcana Varus as well as the Faerie Kalista line. It's very unlikely you're going to be able to hit Hecarim 3, and if you're not able to hit Hecarim 3 until other people start dying, the question is, are you stable on Hecarim 2? And the answer now is a lot less likely. So you're probably not going to be able to hit Hecarim 3, which means this is not as good as it was before. Scoreboard Scrapper into either of the AD default options is incredibly strong. The main issue with this is that if you take this, you're not taking an Econ Augment on 2-1, which means if you're contested Varus or contested Kalista, you're going to have a tough time hitting. However, if you are able to hit with Scoreboard Scrapper, this has one of the highest win rates rates in the entire game. It is unbelievably broken if you are able to hit. Aggressive Preservation into either of the Preserver lines. The AP Preserver lines can be quite good. These Hunting Frenzy and Category 5, both good with the Hunter lines, whether that be Kog'Maw or Jinx Wukong, but not completely broken. Prismatic Ticket into Ziggs Cassiopeia is still good, still viable, still S tier if you're able to hit the entire board, which you should be able to with Prismatic Ticket. They buffed Ahri, but because of the change in the meta where it's so revolving around 4 cost, it's actually got moved down to A tier just because it just can't keep up with the existing lines in the meta. It's still viable if you have Prismatic Ticket. It's still the biggest negative delta augment that you can get with this comp, but it's not as strong as it was before. And then the last 2 options here are 6 Shaped Dragons with either Draconic Mastery or Upgraded Adventure. They bug fixed Draconic Mastery so that it no longer provided takedowns from the PvE rounds, and it's pretty noticeable. You're probably not going to be able to get Smolder in stage 4 like you could before if you're not able to win the overwhelming majority of your rounds in stage 2 and stage 3. So that's why this condition was added. Are you strong? If you are very strong, this could be like A tier or even S tier if you're able to find Shyvana 3 very quickly, but most of the time you're probably just going to die before you find the Smolder, and that's the big issue here. The last option here is an Upgraded Adventure into Namzi reroll, where you're looking to reroll the Namzi, Elise, Twitch, and Jace in order to get the reward. I think if you hit this on tempo on like 4-1, then it can be pretty good, but it's very risky, and I think if you're in a Prismatic lobby, you probably have better options to go for than trying to take this huge risk on this particular line that you'll be able to hit on tempo, because in general, just going one of the default options is probably going to be better. All right, let's talk about openers for this particular patch, starting off with the 1 and 2 cost tier list for stage 1. This is all about trying to understand what units you should hold on to with the limited amount of gold that you have in the early game. So the units that are in S tier, I'm pretty much always going to hold on to them because they're core for creating a lot of the main openers that exist for the patch. Anything in A tier usually pairs well with things in S tier. Anything in B tier usually is kind of conditional for different openers. Usually they're not going to show up as often. And then anything in C tier is highly conditional and most of the time is not going to be used in most openers. So usually I'll end up selling these units. Now let's go through some openers examples, starting off with the Frost opener. So let me go ahead and remove this Kog'Maw here. I already did a take here, so that's why there's some changes here. So the big thing with this one is that you can actually itemize this towards either AP or AD. So let's say you're angling towards Varus. In that case, you can just go ahead and put an IE on Twitch. But if you're also angling towards, say, Ryze or Karma, then you just go ahead and put something like Shiv or Morello onto your Zillion, or Shojin if you're playing into Karma. And this is something that will kind of get you over through the early game because the Frost opener is so good, because the Frost Soldier actually has a pretty high amount of HP in the early game. Another opener here is the Hunter opener with Vanguards. So there's mainly 2 things you can do with this. The first is you can angle into Varus with AD items, so that would again be your IE slam. The other option here is Shojin, which is pretty flexible because it can go into Varus or it can go into Karma, although a lot of times it ends up going into Varus these days, especially because this is an AD opener. So you're going to want to build more AD items onto Namzi or Twitch. So this is definitely leaning more towards AD. Another option that you have here with the Hunters is you could play around the Shapeshifters with the Hunters. This is a little bit better because of the Shyvana pairing well with the Namzi, but sometimes you're going to find it a little bit more difficult to get Frost online until you're able to find Swain, which sometimes can be difficult. But if you are able to find Swain and then add Zillion to your board, this can be one of the best level 5 boards that currently exist in the game. Another opener here is the Portal opener. So the ideal 4th unit here is Neeko. It does not have to be Neeko. So this could be Poppy here for Witchcraft. It could be Shyvana for just Shapeshifter, but the best unit here is Neeko that provides both of those things. Witchcraft is very strong in the early game, and most of the time this is going to get played into either Karma or Ryze. Next up here, we have the Scholar Bastion line. So this is how you used to play Bastion RE reroll. Of course, we don't really do that anymore, but you can still use this opener to play into either Ryze preferably, or Karma. Another opener that you have here is the Multi-Striker opener. This is not really getting played as much. Usually you're not going to hold on to Ashe, I think, in a lot of cases here. So I don't typically see this that often anymore. But if you were to be in a spot where, for example, you needed to slam a Rageblade and you have an Ashe 2, maybe you have a bunch of Jaxes, this can be something you can play to eventually angle into Kalista, for example. Another opener here is the Ziggs Honeymancy opener. This is just something that can kind of play into several different things. these. For example, if you have a bunch of Rage Blades, you can just throw these onto Cassiopeia and then eventually angle this into Kalista. You can do a bunch of AP items onto the Ziggs and angle that into either Ryze or Karma, but this is one of the stronger openers that you can get if you can get exactly these 5 units. Another opener here is the Mage opener. I have not seen this opener all that often. The biggest issue with it is the commitment that's required into it. It is AP centric, and you really want to have a mana item in most cases. Something like Shojin Morello on Seraphine can be very, very good, but the problem here is that it is somewhat item dependent. It requires a lot of investment into the mages, and eventually you're going to transition out of the mages, and it's a little bit harder to transition out of mages than it is to transition out of some of the other openers that we've shown so far. So typically you don't see a lot of people going for the mages here because you would just rather hold on to more consistent openers that are easier to hit. Another option that you have here is Tristana with 3 Faerie. This is usually how you're going to angle into Kalista if you're able to find some of these units here. So this is where you would want to build your Rage Blade. You would put your Faerie Crown onto the Tristana and then tank either your Lilia or Poppy. It's fine to tank your Lilia even though she's going to be part of the permanent comp just because you get item removers at each stage. And then the last option here is the 5 Eldritch. This is pretty rare. Most of the time you're not going to have this because the Syndra, the Ashe, and the Nyla are all conditional. Like most of the time you're not holding on to these units. So usually you're not going to get to play into this opener unless you're giving up on other more consistent openers. But I wanted to note it because it is, I think, the highest win rate by far. Very, very strong if you're able to get this, especially with something like School Mascot. But most of the time you're not going to be able to play around this opener. The last thing I want to talk about here is the first item slam tier list. So this is how you should feel about slamming these items as the very first item that you slam of the game. And there's been a couple of changes from last patch. So the first thing is that Infinity Edge has moved from B tier to A tier because of the increase in the strength of Varus. So if you look 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, 2 patches ago, Infinity Edge was all the way down in C tier. It moved up to B tier, and now it's all the way up to A tier thanks to Varus. Last Whisper has actually moved down in this particular patch to B tier because it's not that good in the Varus line. It's also not even that good in the Kalista line. In both of those lines, you'd rather have Even Shroud, which has moved up from D tier up to C tier. Now, the reason why I haven't put Even Shroud higher is that even in those lines, usually you're going to want to make your tank items first. So like Warmogs or Gargoyle is better, I think, in the Kalista line than creating Even Shroud first. And then even in the Varus line, I think it's completely reasonable to slam other tank items first. So I still have Even Shroud in C tier here. Maybe it's B tier, honestly. But in general here, you want to build Even Shroud over Last Whisper in both of the main AD lines. The other change here is that I've moved Adaptive Helm down from B tier to C tier. So this is done the opposite of Infinity Edge, where 2 patches ago it was up in A tier. Now it's down in C tier because of the changes that they made to it. Just doesn't feel that good to slam this item anymore. You would much rather have Archangel, Shiv, Ionic Spark. There's just a lot of things you can be doing with these components that feel better. And then I've also moved Dragon's Claw down from B tier to C tier. This item just kind of feels unmakeable. They kind of nerfed it a lot, and it's pretty noticeable how much they did nerf it. So in general, I don't feel that good about when I slam this item. Most of the time, it's not something I'm looking to slam. I'd rather kill it or kill the 2 cloaks in different ways. So I've moved this down from B tier to C tier, and that is it for the first item slam tier list. And that is it for the flowchart in general. Hopefully this was able to help you out in terms of knowing exactly how to play the patch. Kind of a lot goes into trying to figure these things out, but the good thing is that from now on for the rest of the set, I think there shouldn't be any major shifts. They did say that they were going to try to move away a little bit from this 4-cost heavy meta, so we'll see what happens. Either way, I'll see you next time.